October 11th, 1999. Three college students wave goodbye at a gas station before vanishing into the Northern California wilderness. No distress call, no footprints. Just a disposable camera, a torn hoodie, and a notebook that ends with 7 chilling words: "We shouldn't have split up." Months later, a rescue dog freezes at the base of an ancient tree, and what they find beneath the ice changes everything. This isn't just a disappearance, it's a message buried in the woods, waiting to be heard. October 11th, 1999. A security camera mounted above a weathered gas station flickered to life just after 7:42 a.m. The footage it captured would later be paused, slowed down, analyzed frame by frame, not because of what it revealed, but because of what it would come to represent: the final visual record of 3 lives before they disappeared into the hush of the wilderness. They stood beneath a gray overcast sky, huddled near the rear of a faded red Subaru Outback. Each wore a backpack, their gear mismatched, and lived in more borrowed than bought. Before we step deeper into the forest, where even echoes hesitate and trace the final moments of 3 students swallowed by its silence, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support keeps us walking these forgotten paths, unearthing the names carved into bark and time, the stories no one dares to tell aloud. Every subscription is a light carried into the dark, keeping these lost voices from vanishing forever. What you do here may feel small, but to the echoes waiting in the trees, it means everything. Thank you for not turning away. One of them, identified later as Casey Lynn, 20 years old, adjusted her camera bag before turning to laugh at something off-screen. Her smile was bright, unguarded, the kind of smile you don't wear when you think danger is near. To her left, Ben O'Connell leaned against the car door, hands jammed in the pockets of his army surplus jacket. He glanced at his watch, then at the camera, unaware he'd become a frozen timestamp in someone else's tragedy. The third, Matthew Rye, had already started walking toward the trailhead, a bundle of folded maps peeking from the top of his backpack like overgrown bookmarks. They were students at a university 2 towns over, known for its liberal arts program and crumbling library. Friends since freshman orientation, bonded by long hikes and late-night conspiracy documentaries, they had decided to spend their fall break away from lectures and dorm noise. No cell phones, no itinerary, just the wild, the wind, and each other. The gas station clerk, when interviewed later, said they seemed like the kind of kids who hadn't learned to be afraid of the woods yet. The camera captured them waving once, not at the lens, but towards someone across the lot, a local who had given them directions to a lesser-known loop off the main trail. A shortcut, he called it. The students thanked him. They crossed the road, and then the tree line took them. Their laughter, light, distant, floating in from a world still innocent, was the last sound heard by anyone in the town. What followed, in the days and weeks ahead, was confusion. At first, no one noticed. Their professors assumed they'd skipped out. Friends thought they'd extended their trip. Even Casey's mother, when she left a voicemail, did so with a chuckle. "Don't tell me you 3 went off the grid again." It wasn't until the Subaru was found, untouched and collecting pine needles, that the shift occurred from absence to alarm. But that moment, captured in dull VHS static, the wave, the turn, the walk into trees that seemed to lean inward like they were listening, held within it a gravity that grew heavier with time. Every inch of that frame became sacred, studied. People speculated over the direction of their glances, the nervous scratch of Ben's neck, the way the wind tugged at the corner of Casey's jacket. Yet none of it answered the question that would haunt their families, their town, and the investigators for years. How do 3 people vanish just minutes from the edge of a road, on a trail marked and mapped, in daylight? The footage ends with the camera switching back to an empty lot. Just wind, just silence. The laughter has faded, and the woods have closed their mouth. The trail was known to most simply as Copper Ridge. On paper, it was a 13.7-mile loop that wound through the Northern California backcountry, tracing the jagged spine of the Klamath Mountains. In the spring and summer months, it was a hiker's dream, lush, panoramic, dotted with wildflowers and waterfalls that carved their way into the valley floor. It had appeared in more than one regional travel guide, often described as challenging but rewarding, a phrase that doesn't say much until the terrain turns against you. By October, the story changed. The air thinned, the rivers surged with glacial runoff, and the trail grew fickle with frost and loose shale. Sunlight filtered in shorter, colder bursts through the canopy, and daylight hours shrank like shrinking lungs. Even seasoned hikers often turned back before the halfway mark, but the students didn't plan to complete the full loop. According to the notes found in Matthew's dorm room, their route was to follow the western leg only, cutting across a ridge path that locals no longer used, marked faintly on a 1992 topographic map with the fading label, Raven's Hollow Cut. It was a shortcut. Technically, but it wasn't maintained, not anymore. A ranger who had worked in the area for over 15 years, and who refused to go on record, later described that stretch of land as unruly. He used the word 3 times: unruly weather, unruly terrain, unruly energy. Others in the nearby town of Harrow's End, a dwindling logging community about 40 minutes east, told the crew that the old ridge paths hadn't been officially patrolled in decades. Not since the mid-82nd, when a rockslide made the northern descent impassable. No one cleared it, no one redirected it. It just fell off the maps. Still, those who remembered the trail before it was forgotten didn't speak of landslides or frostbite or the usual threats. They spoke, when they spoke at all, in quiet tones and half glances. One retired forestry worker said he wouldn't camp past the 6th bend. When asked why, he only muttered, "You hear things. That's all." Another woman, the daughter of a man who once helped build early logging roads near Raven's Hollow, claimed her father warned her never to whistle on that part of the trail. Said it called something out of the trees. He wouldn't say more. There was no folklore officially attached to the place, nothing easily searchable or documented. But there was weight to the hesitation in people's voices, as though to speak the truth plainly might summon something best left asleep. It wasn't a ghost story. It was something deeper, a kind of cultural scar tissue that had formed without needing a visible wound. Even the landscape seemed to recoil. Satellite imagery showed the canopy denser over that cut of trail. Wind patterns shifted oddly, gusting east when everything else blew west. One park volunteer recalled their compass spinning uncontrollably near mile 7, only to return to normal once they doubled back. A mechanical error, perhaps, but it was just another thread in a tapestry of incidents too consistent to ignore. The students wouldn't have known this, or if they had, they didn't care. To them, the trail was adventure, a test, a memory waiting to be made, their last. They were drawn to a path that no longer wanted to be walked, into a part of the forest that had forgotten how to welcome strangers. And by the time anyone realized how deep they'd gone, the trail had already swallowed its secret. At first, no one panicked. It started as a passing comment in a shared hallway. "Has anyone seen Matt since Friday?" Someone asked, juggling a coffee and a textbook, already late for class. No one had. But then again, mid-October, at the university, meant midterms, deadlines, stress. Disappearances, even of the temporary kind, were common. People went home, people unplugged. People crumbled under pressure and needed the quiet of the woods, or the blur of a party, or the numbness of disappearing for a weekend. So when Matthew Rye, Casey Lynn, and Ben O'Connell missed Monday morning classes, no alarms rang. Not yet. By Tuesday, the mood shifted. Casey missed a midterm she had studied weeks for. Ben's roommate noticed his bed hadn't been slept in. The Subaru was still gone. And though none of it screamed emergency, something in the silence began to feel off. A phone call went unanswered. A text read but not replied to. A voice message left in hope, then in frustration, then with trembling in the voice. That evening, a professor filed a report not because she feared something terrible had happened, but because those three were dependable. She wrote that phrase exactly, dependable. That was the first sign. Wednesday came, and with it, the weather. A sudden storm system pushed in from the Pacific, unexpected, vicious, early. Rain lashed at the roads, and high winds battered the coast. Trees bent. Power flickered. In Harrow's End, the nearby town closest to the trail, flash floods carved deep rivulets into gravel paths. Search and rescue teams who might have mobilized earlier were grounded. Helicopters stayed in hangars, visibility was zero. By the time the call to local authorities came from Casey's father in San Diego, his voice tense, repeating her name as if saying it enough might bring her back, the first critical hours had already passed. But still, the response was slow. Dispatch treated the situation cautiously, maybe even skeptically. 3 college kids, known to be outdoorsy, with a history of wandering off the grid for days at a time? This wasn't the first call they'd gotten like that. Most ended the same way, with an embarrassed return and a story about no signal or a dead battery. One officer told Casey's mother bluntly, "It's not unusual. They'll come back when they're ready." But then someone checked the parking area near the Copper Ridge trailhead. The Subaru was there, locked, undisturbed. A receipt from the gas station dated October 11th lay on the dashboard. Inside the trunk were extra blankets, bottled water, and a half-packed emergency kit intended for their return. And on the passenger seat, a folded trail map with a section circled in blue ink. By Thursday, search and rescue teams were finally deployed. The storm had passed but left behind a mangled, sodden wilderness. Mudslides had altered known paths. Debris choked foot trails. Whatever footprints the students had left were long erased. Helicopters flew overhead but saw only trees, miles and miles of evergreen silence. A missing person poster went up by the weekend, but even then, it felt premature. Some still believed they'd show up. Lost, maybe, but alive. Waiting it out in a cave, or tucked into some cabin they stumbled upon. But the days stretched. Their phones remained off. No credit cards were used. No one came down the mountain. And the woods offered no hint, no echo, not even a broken branch out of place. The three were simply gone. In the dorms, students whispered of it, as if speaking too loudly would tempt fate. Professors stared out windows longer than usual. And in a weathered ranger station miles away, a man circled the same section of map over and over, already fearing what others would take weeks to believe. The forest had taken them. And it wasn't planning to give them back. It happened faster than anyone expected. Weather, in the Northern California mountains, has always obeyed a logic of its own. What begins as a misty morning can descend into whiteout conditions by noon, and what seems like a clearing sky can shut again like a trapdoor. Locals knew this. They read the trees, the way the moss curled, the pitch of the wind. But for outsiders, for 3 students chasing wilderness on borrowed maps, nature doesn't offer warnings. It just changes. On October 13th, just 2 days after the students were last seen on camera, the temperature dropped 14 degrees in a single night. The sun disappeared behind a slate-colored ceiling. Then came the wind. It pushed through the mountain passes like a living thing, scattering pine needles in thick mats and sending gullies of dirt skimming across trail markers. Search teams later said it was the kind of wind that didn't howl, it hissed. Low, steady, cutting. And with it came the first snow of the season. Not a flurry, not a dusting. A snowfall that blanketed the upper ridges in white silence, rendering terrain unrecognizable. Those familiar with the Copper Ridge Trail said it was too early in the season. The snow wasn't due for weeks. But it came anyway, hard and fast, collapsing the search timeline from cautious optimism into urgent futility. Flashback imagery from park cameras showed how quickly the terrain transformed. One day, muddy, leaf-littered switchbacks. The next, a pale expanse stretching into a horizonless void. Snow as deep as a forearm swallowed the lower paths. Ridge markers vanished. Trees, bowed under the weight, snapped in the night like distant gunshots. All evidence of movement footprints, broken twigs, scattered crumbs of human presence was wiped clean. The land reset itself, erasing its own memory. Rescue helicopters, requested the moment the storm rolled in, were grounded for days. Visibility dropped to near zero. Radar became unreliable over the uneven terrain, and pilots refused to fly blind over slopes that twisted unpredictably between ravines and tree lines. For the families, it was agony. Help was there, hovering just out of reach, unable to lift above the cloud bank. The sky had turned against them. On the ground, volunteers found themselves walking in circles. GPS units blinked with static. Compasses swirled unpredictably. One team claimed they passed the same rock outcropping 3 times in the span of an hour, despite walking straight. Maps began to feel useless, as if the land beneath their feet had shifted when they weren't looking. One ranger wrote in his notebook, "It's like the woods are closing in behind us." Animals, too, seemed to vanish. No birds, no rustling underbrush. Even the usual signs of deer or bear were gone. The forest didn't feel empty. It felt expectant. Still, in retrospect, the storm was more than just an obstacle. It was a transformation. It turned a populated trail into a void. It rendered technology impotent. It denied the panicked calls of parents and the boots of would-be rescuers. It made the mountain complicit. Nature, that week, became a co-conspirator in the silence. And while no one said it out loud, not in briefings or interviews or late-night vigils, the truth crept in like the frost. Whatever the students had encountered, whatever clues they might have left behind, were buried now beneath ice and time. The forest had closed the door, and behind it, something waited. The first official search began at dawn on October 15th, 4 days after the students were last seen. A dozen volunteers gathered near the Copper Ridge trailhead, armed with flashlights, orange vests, and the kind of hope that still believes in logical outcomes. The plan was simple: fan out along the known trail, sweep the marked loop, follow the most likely routes. They expected, at worst, to find the students huddled in a makeshift shelter, cold and embarrassed, offering a story about losing track of time or taking a wrong turn. But by nightfall, there was nothing. No sign. Not even a discarded wrapper or a footprint in the thawing mud. Just wind and silence, and trees that refused to offer up secrets. Over the next few days, the search widened. Helicopters returned to the sky, now that the storm had passed, but the snow cover made it nearly impossible to detect any meaningful pattern from above. Dogs were brought in highly trained, capable of picking up the faintest human scent. They barked at tree hollows, scratched at rocks, circled certain clearings with a frenzy that stirred brief surges of adrenaline among the teams. But each time, it led to nothing. No clothing. No trace of blood, no remains. Just places where something once might have been. As days stretched into weeks, the operation transformed from a search into a ritual. Volunteers returned again and again, some traveling from out of state, driven not by duty but by the gnawing need to finish the sentence that had started when those 3 disappeared. The forest, once a space for beauty and escape, took on the mood of a crime scene. Whispered theories grew in number. Some said they must have fallen, slipped down a ravine, perhaps, and become trapped where no line of sight could reach them. Others speculated they had encountered wildlife, a bear or a mountain lion. But no drag marks, no blood, no feeding signs were found. Soon, the theories darkened. Hikers spoke of strange figures seen at dusk, shadows in the tree line that never moved, never approached. One woman claimed to have heard what sounded like a woman's voice crying for help deep in the canyon, but when rangers rappelled down, they found only rocks and ice. Another volunteer reported finding a series of cairns stacked stones that weren't on the trail before. He dismantled one out of suspicion, only to find a rabbit skull placed beneath the last stone, clean and hollow. Rumors grew legs in town. Theories of cult activity resurfaced, dredged up from old newspaper clippings about unsolved disappearances in the 1,970 seconds. Someone brought up the church road again, the forgotten offshoot trail where maps went fuzzy and compasses misbehaved. Old-timers warned newcomers not to chase ghosts. A few volunteers began to keep journals of the search, not for records, but to deal with the dreams. They wrote about getting lost in places they knew by heart, about waking with the sound of names whispered in their ears. The official search continued for 23 days. After that, funding thinned, and the team shrank. The posters faded on bulletin boards. Media coverage slowed. But even as the forest grew colder and more impenetrable, something beneath it stirred. 3 young lives had vanished into a place that did not give answers, and every step forward felt less like progress and more like trespassing. It began with a glove, not discovered by a search party or an officer, but by a retired logger named Eli Monroe who had joined the volunteer effort during its second week. He knew the Copper Ridge area better than most. His father had worked the hills when the logging roads were still active, and he insisted on checking old fence lines no longer listed on the maps. On October 28th, he found the glove. It was wedged between the rusted barbs of a sagging wire fence that traced a forgotten trail used decades ago for hauling timber. The glove was weather-worn, soaked through from melting snow, but still intact. It was navy blue, synthetic, a cheap brand you could buy in a gas station rack. Later, Casey's roommate would confirm it was hers. He had seen her wearing it the week before they left, complaining about how the seams kept snagging on her camera strap. There was no blood, no sign of a struggle, just a glove, caught mid-motion, like someone had reached through the wire or tried to climb it and lost it without noticing. Or without time to notice. 2 days later, rangers found something else. A disposable camera mud-splattered, its film compartment intact, jammed deep into a hollow stump about half a mile from the main trail. It had to have been placed there, not dropped. The opening in the tree was too narrow for it to fall in by chance. And the camera itself was relatively dry, protected by the bark. When it was developed, the roll yielded only 7 images. 4 were overexposed beyond recognition. 2 showed dense tree cover with no distinguishable landmarks. And 1, the final frame, showed a blurred image of what looked like a clearing at night, the frame illuminated by a sudden flash and a streak of movement in the upper corner too distorted to identify. Experts debated whether the blur was an animal, a person, or just a trick of motion. But the photo only raised more questions. Why hide the camera? Why not bring it back, unless someone stopped them? These discoveries did not spark relief. They fed a quiet dread. On November 3rd, a backpack was recovered from the base of a ravine, torn open and emptied. It had no name tag, but inside one of its side compartments was a rolled-up flyer for a college debate. Casey had participated in the semester prior. Nearby, searchers found a crushed granola bar wrapper and a cracked plastic water bottle with chew marks that, according to a wildlife expert, weren't consistent with any native predator. The backpack's straps had been severed, not worn away. Yet still no bodies, no signs of shelter, no bones, no boot prints. The forest gave up bits of story, but not its ending. Traces, scattered like breadcrumbs from a trail that doubled back on itself and vanished into mist. The search teams marked each location on their maps with red flags. Each item felt like a message left mid-sentence. Something had happened. That was undeniable. But the how, the when, and especially the why, stayed locked beneath the surface. And over time, Those flags on the map began to form a rough shape, not a trail or a loop, but a circle, closed, contained. As if whatever had unfolded in those woods had never planned to let them leave. It was nearly mist, half buried beneath a bed of pine needles, soaked through from days of rain and snowfall, its cover warped and beginning to dissolve at the edges. A search team combing the southern ridge stumbled upon it by accident, thinking at first it was trash, maybe an old field guide tossed aside by a careless camper. But when one of the volunteers peeled back the cover, they found handwriting, a name, Matthew Rye, printed in hurried block letters. And then, beneath that, fragments, incomplete thoughts, smeared ink, a collapsing narrative trying to hold itself together. The notebook was small, spiral-bound, the kind sold in packs of 3 at corner stores near campus. Most of the pages had fused together, the ink bled into an abstract blur. But here and there, between water damage and mildew, words survived. Phrases written in different pressures, some sharp and frantic, others calm and almost childlike. Like a conversation had been taking place, or a dissent. The first decipherable entry appeared to be a list of coordinates, hand-drawn in the corner of a page that had been folded and refolded until it nearly tore. The numbers corresponded loosely with a remote section of Copper Ridge, the area where the backpack and camera had been found. No known trails intersected there. When examined by park rangers later, the coordinates led to a rocky outcrop surrounded by dense underbrush, so thick it was barely accessible. Nothing of note was found at the site, except for one thing. A strange scorch mark along the roots of a tree, circular, precise, as if something had burned momentarily and vanished. Further in the notebook, a poem. Or what might have been one. The lines were erratic, almost manic. The meter collapsed halfway through, and certain words repeated more than once, as if the writer couldn't escape them. Where the sky hums low and the tree line bends, we came as 3, we go as. The line ended there, the final words smeared into oblivion by a streak of black mold. Another page bore crude sketches. A series of stick figures in motion, walking along what seemed to be a cliffside or ridge. One figure always lagged behind. In the margin next to this sketch, the word watching appeared over and over, each time in darker pencil strokes. Below it, a question in all caps. Is it still behind us? But it was the last legible line that froze those who read it. Written on the inside back cover, separate from the rest, as if added later in a different hand or mood, were 7 words. We shouldn't have split up. No punctuation. Just the sentence, flat and resigned, like a note left for someone who'd never return to read it. The implications were immediate. The students had separated whether out of panic, necessity, or disagreement. It was a fatal decision, one that almost always leads to silence in wilderness cases. But the notebook gave more than just a tactical error. It hinted at fear, at something unseen. An investigator who handled the notebook later remarked that the pages felt heavier than they should, as if they carried more than water. It's not just the writing, he said. It's what's missing between the words. Whatever happened on that trail had begun long before the weather turned or the storm moved in. The notebook didn't just document the descent into confusion. It suggested something pursued them into it. Something that made silence contagious. Something that made a group of close friends choose to walk alone. By the end of October, the forest was sealed in silence. Snow piled high along the ridge paths, turning landmarks into ghostly humps and familiar crossings into blank, treacherous spans. What little remained of the students' trail had long been swallowed, footprints erased, flagged markers bent under ice, and whatever human scent lingered, carried off by wind. The official search, once brimming with urgency, had thinned into routine sweeps, measured and mechanical. Each effort felt more like obligation than hope. November came, and with it, the first vigil. Held on campus, beneath the fading gold of maple trees, hundreds gathered in quiet candlelight. Professors spoke in soft voices about promise and potential. Friends shared fragments of memory, inside jokes, long walks back from class, the warmth of their laughter. Someone played a song that Casey loved, though no one could remember its name. It was a goodbye, disguised as a prayer for return. At home, families lit candles of their own. Some framed missing person posters with seasonal decorations, as if layering holiday rituals over the absence might coax the lost back to the door. Parents left porch lights on deep into December. Stockings were hung with names untouched, but the silence held. Online, the story found another life. What began as message board speculation turned into sprawling threads and amateur investigations. Reddit, early forums, true crime blogs, they all took the case and ran. Someone created a map overlay of every item recovered in the woods. Another user posted what they claimed was enhanced audio from the camcorder found weeks earlier, slowed down to isolate the final seconds of static. "There's something behind the wind," one post read. "You can hear it breathing." Theories multiplied, wild and conflicting. Some insisted the students had faked their own disappearance, an elaborate plan to escape the world and live off-grid, free from academic pressure and digital noise. Others were certain it had been an accident, a rockfall, a wrong turn, exposure. But those explanations never sat right with the people who knew them. Casey was meticulous. Ben always left a plan. Matthew had scheduled a tutoring session the day after they were due back. Then the more sinister ideas took hold. A former forest ranger claimed on a late-night radio program that the area the students vanished in had a history. He didn't elaborate, but that was enough. Posts began surfacing about the old trail, an overgrown path not found on modern maps but passed down by locals in fading stories. Supposedly, it had once connected Copper Ridge to a logging settlement that was abandoned after a series of disappearances in the 1940s. The trail was closed officially in 1951, though no one could produce the documents. Still, some swore they had walked it. One hiker wrote, "It loops back, but not the way you came. You don't know you've gone too far until the sounds stop." Whispers of cult activity followed. Animal bones arranged in patterns, strange symbols carved into birch bark, an alleged photograph of a crude altar deep in the forest, posted anonymously and quickly deleted. Theories collided with folklore, and fiction braided into fact, until it became impossible to know where truth ended and obsession began. But amid the noise, a quieter current persisted: grief. 3 months passed, and no bodies were found. No new clues surfaced. What remained was absence, stretching longer each day. The forest stood, indifferent and undisturbed, its secret buried under snow. And the people who waited, who watched the trailhead from a distance, began to understand what most never say aloud: that sometimes, the earth does not return what it takes. The forest had long since quieted by the time Frank Callahan returned to it. It was early February 2000, and most had given up. The news had moved on, the posters were fading, and the names Matthew Rye, Casey Lynn, Ben O'Connell had become footnotes in missing persons databases, their case categorized as unsolved, presumed dead. But for Frank, a retired firefighter with a face worn by wind and sorrow, there was no such thing as closure without a body. He knew what it meant to live with that kind of hole. His own son had vanished overseas in 1987, never found, and though the pain had softened into something quieter over the years, it never left him. It hummed like old grief always does, low and constant, just under the skin. Mira, his German shepherd, was nearing the end of her working years. Her joints stiffened in the cold, and her snout had begun to gray around the edges, but she still knew the forest like a second skin. She had been part of dozens of recovery operations, some successful, others haunting. Frank didn't expect much on that frigid morning. The search had been suspended for weeks. Snow still clung to the shadowed sides of the ridge, but something he never could quite say what had drawn him back. A feeling, maybe. A dream. or simply the unfinished sentence of it all. They set out at dawn, just the two of them, crossing into the woods near the old fire road that veered off from Copper Ridge. Frank had mapped every trail in the area, but today he chose a route slightly off the established grid, following a game path worn faint by deer and time. It was a place no one had searched seriously before. Too far off the marked trail, too obscured by fallen trees and steep inclines. It was the kind of place that could easily be overlooked, even by trained eyes. 15 minutes in, Mira froze. No bark, no growl, just stillness. Her body taut, one paw lifted, ears forward, eyes locked on a massive cedar tree that rose like a sentinel from the frozen ground. It was older than anything else nearby, gnarled, its bark blackened in places, its roots sprawling like fingers into the soil. Frank called her name softly. She didn't move, that was all he needed. He approached slowly, crunching ice beneath his boots, heart pounding harder than it should have. The ground around the cedar was disturbed. The snow melted in an odd, uneven circle. Steam rose faintly where the sun touched dark earth. And then he saw it. Not a body. Not yet. But something had been buried. He dropped to one knee and brushed away the loose top layer of soil. There, nestled among the roots, was a crude object woven from twigs, bones, and animal sinew. A kind of talisman, shaped like a looped figure eight, with a small strip of dark red fabric knotted through its center. He didn't recognize the symbol, but the fabric was unmistakable. It matched the hoodie Ben O'Connell had been wearing the day he disappeared. Frank radioed it in. Within hours, the quiet forest was alive. Again, boots, voices, cameras. But for those first moments, it was just Frank, Mira, and the cedar. Something had happened here. Not just a loss, but a marker, a message. It wasn't just a place where someone might have died. It was a place someone had chosen to remember, or to be remembered. The frost had hardened the ground into something almost metallic, a crusted shell of ice and earth that resisted every tool, every gloved hand trying to break through. The talisman lay just beneath that layer, not deep, but hidden well enough that time and weather had kept it concealed for months. When Mira led them there, still and unblinking beside that ancient cedar, it was as if the forest had paused to listen. And when the first layer of snow was cleared away, what emerged from the earth was not what anyone had prepared for. It was small, no larger than a human fist, woven from strips of bark, dried vine, and something more sinister, small animal bones, bird perhaps, threaded like beads through twine that looked handmade and brittle. Some of the bones still had faint, fresh traces of tissue. Not fossilized, not decayed. Recent, deliberate. Someone had assembled this. Someone had taken their time. The shape of the object was unsettling. A twisted loop, like an infinity symbol malformed, with one side larger than the other. At its center, tied tightly and weather-worn, was a strip of red fabric, faded and fraying at the edges. It was unmistakable. Bright cardinal red, the same hue as the University of Pacific Heights merchandise. A hoodie. Ben's hoodie. Photos showed him wearing it the day he walked into the woods. His mother had mentioned it often, her voice catching each time how he never hiked without it, how she'd begged him to wear something warmer. Now here it was, torn and knotted into something that didn't belong. Detectives at the scene didn't touch the talisman at first. They stared at it, murmuring theories, waiting for the forensics unit to arrive. A few took photos. One officer, younger, asked quietly whether it was some kind of Native American marker, but an anthropologist later confirmed it didn't resemble any known cultural artifact. In fact, it didn't match anything in the state or federal databases. Not indigenous, not ritualistic in any documented sense. It was something else. The most chilling detail, however, wasn't the object itself. It was what surrounded it. The patch of ground where it had been buried showed signs of heat. Snow melted faster there than in the surrounding area. The soil oddly soft, despite sub-freezing temperatures. Forensics noted a faint chemical smell in the earth like ash or burnt resin, but no source was ever found. And beneath that talisman, buried a few inches deeper, searchers found more bone fragments. Small, hollow, some split cleanly, as though by force. None human. But the placement wasn't random. The talisman had been nestled deliberately, its loop facing upward, the fabric tied so tightly it had cut into the twig itself. This wasn't something discarded or forgotten. It had been left there with intent. As a marker, as a warning, or maybe as a gate. That night, the search team camped further from the site than usual. No one said it aloud, but the distance was intentional. One of the seasoned rangers packed up early the next morning and never returned to the operation. He told a colleague, "I don't care what they found, I just know we weren't supposed to find it." News of the discovery was kept quiet at first. The families were notified, the scene sealed off, and a pathologist was brought in to examine the bones. The results came back inconclusive. Not human, not fully animal either. Fragmented, like pieces of something larger, or remains from different sources. It made no sense. But then again, nothing had made sense since October. The forest had offered something. Not a body, not a confession. But a piece of the puzzle, soaked in ice and silence, daring them to ask the question no one had voiced aloud until then. What if they weren't alone out there? What if they had never been alone to begin with? The map they used had no trail where the forest said otherwise. That was the first anomaly. Just a stretch of dense woodland marked as impassable, its lines washed out with time and bureaucracy. But when the investigators traced the direction Mira had taken, and cross-referenced the coordinates scribbled in Matthew's notebook, they found something there, something the Earth had tried to forget. The path wasn't obvious. It wasn't even a trail in the conventional sense, not at first glance. It began as a thinning in the tree line, where the undergrowth pulled back just enough to suggest passage. But the deeper they followed it, the clearer it became. Someone, or something, had walked this way many times. Moss-worn bare in strips beneath the trees, low branches broken in consistent patterns, stones arranged unnaturally along the edges, half buried, like old markers obscured by the passing of years. They walked for nearly a mile before the GPS lost signal entirely. Compasses spun. The air grew heavier, more humid despite the winter cold. It was as if they had stepped out of time. A silence settled total, thick, the kind that hums in your skull and makes you acutely aware of your own breath. That's when one of the local deputies, older, more weathered than the rest, stopped and muttered a name. The church road. The others turned to him. "I haven't heard that name in years," he said, almost to himself. It had once been part of local lore, an old game trail that veered off from the main logging paths decades ago. Hunters avoided it. Locals didn't talk about it much, except in warnings whispered to children or exchanged quietly between bartenders and park workers when the nights stretched too long. The story went that it had once been the proposed route to a mountaintop chapel, back in the 1942, when settlers planned to build a mission in the hills. But the project was abandoned under strange circumstances. Workers reportedly quit mid-construction, tools left behind, wages unpaid. Some claimed there had been accidents, fatal ones. Others spoke of unease, of tools that disappeared overnight, of whispers in the trees. No church was ever built. The path remained, nameless on the maps, passed down only through murmurs and warnings. What disturbed the investigators most wasn't just that the path existed, it was what lined it. About 2 miles in, the forest changed character. The trees grew closer together, the bark darker, branches twisted in unnatural angles. Along the path were remnants, objects half consumed by nature. An iron hinge in the dirt, a brick, perfectly rectangular, too clean to belong. A rusted crossbeam embedded in the ground like a bone out of place. And further in, lodged between two leaning trees, was a slat of wood carved crudely with a single word, barely legible through decay. Sanctum. Beneath it, something like a sigil had been etched, a spiral intersected by two jagged lines. One of the searchers took a photo. The image later corrupted when transferred to a hard drive. No one could explain why. They never found any foundation, no structure or ruins that could confirm a church had ever stood there. But the path kept going, winding deeper, refusing to end. Each step forward felt harder, heavier, as if the woods themselves resisted the intrusion. And when they finally turned back, hours later, half of them swore the return trail was different. Twists they didn't recall, trees in new places, silence that deepened the further they walked. The church road was never meant to be walked twice. Somewhere along it, something had happened. Maybe to Matthew, maybe to all of them. But if the trail was a door, no one wanted to find out what it opened to. Not yet, not without answers. And the forest, still, quiet, watchful, offered none. They found it by accident. The search team had been following the faint remnants of the unmarked trail known only in whispered fragments as the church road. A sudden shift in the underbrush revealed an incline, a rise in the land that hadn't shown on any topographic map. The forest grew tangled there, more like a thicket than a trail, and they almost turned back. But one of the younger rangers caught a glimpse of straight lines through the branches, something square and unnatural in a place where everything bent and curved with age. They pushed forward. The structure came into view slowly, as if the woods didn't want to give it up all at once. At first, it looked like a trick of the light, a dark smudge at the base of a pine cluster. But as they stepped closer, they saw the outline of a roofline, slanted and sagging. The wood grayed and softened by decades of weather. A single rusted stovepipe jutted from the top like a broken limb. It had been a cabin once, hunting or logging, no one could say. But it wasn't marked on any regional surveys. The last recorded structure in this area had been demolished in the early 60s. This wasn't supposed to be here. The door hung crooked on one hinge. When they stepped inside, their boots sank slightly into the soft floorboards, warped and spongy from water damage. But the interior was not what they expected. Despite the rot, despite the sense of abandonment, there were signs that someone had been there recently. A nest of burnt matches lay beside a blackened tin can, still faintly smelling of char. Two sleeping bags, both torn at the seams, were unrolled and arranged as if hurriedly used and left. One was stuffed with crumpled clothing, Ben's jacket, torn at the shoulder, and a single, dirt-caked sneaker that matched the description of the pair Matthew had been wearing. A broken flashlight sat on the windowsill. Its bulb was shattered, the casing cracked like it had been thrown. The batteries had been removed. The most disturbing detail wasn't the items, though. It was the door. On the inside, long scratches had been carved into the wood, deep and erratic. Not claw marks, not quite. They were too long, too deliberate, too human. Parallel lines at varying heights, as if someone had scraped or clawed at it from within during a moment of desperation. The edge of the frame showed similar wear, grooves etched where fingers or tools had repeatedly struck it. The door bore no lock on the inside. On the back wall, above the remains of a shattered mirror, someone had written a single phrase in black ink, jagged and smeared as though the pen had dried and bled in one motion. It waits when we sleep. No names, no dates, just that. Forensics couldn't determine how long the cabin had been used. The remnants inside suggested at least one night, maybe two. Long enough for fear to settle in. Long enough for the trail to end here, at least for some of them. But there was no sign of Casey. Only two sleeping bags, only two articles of clothing. And outside, where the snow had melted in uneven patches around the perimeter, searchers noticed the footprints led in but none led out. It was as if whoever had taken shelter there never left. or was never allowed to. The camcorder was found half buried in ash near the rusted wood stove, its plastic casing warped from heat but surprisingly intact. One of the searchers noticed the corner of a fabric strap poking out from beneath a layer of charred bark. They pulled it free carefully, brushing soot from the viewfinder, expecting it to be broken beyond recognition. But when the battery compartment was pried open and a fresh power cell installed, the device hummed to life with a low, mechanical whir. Inside was a single tape. No label, no markings, just dust and a faint smear of something that looked like ash or dried sap. The forensic team transferred the contents immediately, unsure if the fragile film would hold up to repeated playback. The footage was recovered in full, 27 minutes in total. Most of it was damaged static, washed out visuals, muffled audio, but enough remained to piece together a fragment of what happened after the 3 students vanished into the forest. The first few minutes are what you'd expect. The kind of innocent, aimless footage that fills the memory of any trip. Casey turning the camera on Ben, who makes a face and ducks behind a tree. Matthew narrating in a mock documentary voice about the noble wilderness. The 3 of them laughing, trudging uphill, limbs heavy with gear and optimism. The timestamp flickers, then stabilizes. October 11, 1999, 2:14 p.m. The forest is bright in those frames, golden light spilling between the trees. But as the footage continues, that brightness fades, shadows lengthen, the tone shifts. The camera is handed off, becomes shakier, less intentional. A shot of the sun dipping behind the ridge. A close-up of the trail map with someone, likely Matthew, tracing a finger along an unlabeled fork in the path. Voices off-camera argue, not heated, but tense. The words are hard to distinguish, blurred by wind and distance, but fragments surface. You said this was the shortcut. We've been going in circles. Just one more ridge, then down. The next minute of tape is black, no image. Only the low hum of background forest noise. And beneath that, something else barely audible. A sound like breathing, but slow, wet, rhythmic. Then, the image returns. It's night. The camera is perched on a rock or backpack, partially obscured by movement. The flashlight beam cuts through the dark in short bursts. Casey is speaking, her voice anxious but controlled. She says they've lost the trail. That they'll stay put for the night. Matthew agrees, barely visible in the corner of the frame. Ben is pacing. He mutters something about hearing footsteps behind them. The others dismiss it. And then, for a split second, something appears behind them in the trees. It's not clear, grainy, blurred by movement and shadow, but a shape emerges from the black. Tall, still, too far to make out, yet unmistakably not one of them. It doesn't move. It doesn't flinch under the beam of the flashlight, and then it's gone. The remaining footage is fragmented, scrambled. One clip shows Matthew whispering urgently into the camera, sweat on his brow, lips cracked. The audio is distorted, but the words "not alone" and "circle" are repeated several times. In another segment, Ben is alone, staring directly into the lens. His face is pale, wild-eyed. He says nothing. A twig snaps off camera, and he jerks away. The final shot lasts 13 seconds. It's from a low angle, the camera tilted on its side as if dropped. Heavy breathing fills the audio. The camera lies still, pointed at the canopy, trees swaying above in silence. Then a shape leans into the frame, partially obscured, like a figure crouching low beside the camera. No face, no voice. Just watching. Then the tape ends. And no one speaks for a long time after it's played. The first time the audio was reviewed, no one noticed it. Understandably so. Between the grainy footage, the muffled wind, and the rising panic in the students' voices, it was easy to write off strange noises as artifacts, distortions caused by cold batteries or magnetic interference. But when the footage was handed over to a forensics lab specializing in audio enhancement, a pattern began to emerge. It wasn't a malfunction. It was speech. And it didn't belong to any of the 3 students. The team at the lab, working in a soundproof booth with high-grade waveform analysis software, identified 4 distinct vocal signatures. Casey's voice was the easiest, sharp, clear, often closest to the microphone. Ben's was deeper, measured, until it broke into fragments near the final third of the recording. Matthew's was more sporadic, often off-camera, muttering as he consulted the map or tried to calm the others. Those 3 voices were catalogued quickly. The 4th was harder. It first appeared subtly, buried beneath the natural sounds of the forest. A breath, a murmur? Something too quiet to register consciously, but there nonetheless. It came at irregular intervals, never during the same parts of speech, never overlapping with the known voices. The lab technicians began isolating the frequency bands. What they uncovered made the room go still. A whisper, not once, but 5 times across the recording. Same tonal register, same cadence, but not the same words. Each phrase lasted between 1 and 2 seconds. Each was spoken too fast for immediate interpretation, and in a dialect that didn't conform to any known language. Not English, not Latin, not a Native American dialect, not even glossolalia. The closest match, according to the lab's linguistic software, was an ancient Baltic root language that had no known living speakers. But even that was speculative, a guess in the dark. The phrases themselves, once isolated and slowed, sent a chill through everyone who heard them. The first was a guttural series of syllables that sounded like "eth ha more." The second, clearer, repeated the same structure, but changed tone like it was calling something, or responding. The 5th and final instance occurred during the 13-second clip at the end of the tape, when the camera lay sideways, unmoving, aimed at the sky. In that moment, the voice whispered something unmistakably close to English. A drawn-out whisper, "Don't turn around." When the audio analyst first played that portion for the investigative team, no one spoke for several minutes. One officer asked if it could have been one of the students mimicking something. The lab confirmed it wasn't. The vocal profile didn't match any of the students, and more disturbingly, it didn't match any known human profiles. The vocal register had anomalous overtones, frequencies only partially audible to the human ear, overlapping like 2 voices speaking at once. The official report labeled the voice as unidentified. The public was never informed of its presence. But those who heard it, who sat in that dim room with the volume turned up and the lights off, walked away with the same feeling. That this wasn't just a case of disappearance. It wasn't even just tragedy. It was intrusion. Something had spoken that was not supposed to speak. Something had followed that was never meant to be seen. And whatever it was, it had waited for silence. Waited to speak when fear made listening impossible. The 4th voice was not loud. It didn't need to be. It had always been there. It had simply been waiting to be heard. By the time federal investigators were called in, the case had already twisted into something unrecognizable. It no longer fit the mold of a typical missing persons report. Too much time had passed. Too many pieces didn't align. The discoveries, the talisman, the notebook, the voice on the tape all hinted at a deeper fracture. And with every new layer unearthed, the sense grew that this wasn't merely about 3 young people vanishing in the wilderness. It was about something older. Something rehearsed. The designation Echo Protocol didn't come from official procedure. It wasn't bureaucratic or drawn from any formal investigative guide. It emerged, almost instinctively, after one agent read the notebook found in the woods and noticed a phrase repeated 3 times on separate pages. Scrawled in different sizes, underlined once, it read, "Echo doesn't speak first." It was cryptic, like everything else. But then, while reviewing the camcorder tape again, the the same agent heard something in the fourth voice's whisper hidden in the static, almost imperceptible. Slowed down, digitally isolated, it repeated a similar phrase, "Echo waits." That was enough. From that moment, the working name of the investigation changed. Unofficially at first, passed between agents in hushed tones, then scrawled across files and audio logs. Echo Protocol became shorthand for everything they couldn't classify. It was a label not for what they understood, but for what they feared they might be beginning to. The phrase unsettled people in ways they couldn't articulate. It suggested repetition, pattern, ritual. Not an accident, not a single, chaotic tragedy, but a sequence, something that had happened before and might happen again. Echoes don't begin, they answer, they follow. One agent, speaking off the record, said, "This doesn't feel like a rescue mission anymore. It feels like a reenactment." The deeper they dug into the timeline, the more that theory held weight. The students' final days weren't marked by randomness, they showed signs of a slow choreography. Splitting up, returning to places already past, the trail forming a loop, symbols repeated in the notebook, the camera turning on at strange moments. The scratches inside the cabin door vertical, almost tally-like, as if counting something unseen. Waiting for it. Even the placement of the talisman beneath the cedar tree seemed symbolic. It wasn't buried deep enough to be hidden, just enough to delay discovery. A delay, built into a pattern. Like a fuse, waiting to be lit. A profiler from Quantico was brought in and reviewed the evidence. His summary was short, clinical, but the final line broke from his usual tone. "If this is a human act," he wrote, "it is ritualistic in design. If not human, it mimics ritual with unsettling precision." At that point, conversations within the task force grew strained. Some wanted to shut the operation down entirely, to reclassify it as a cold case. Others, younger or more skeptical, pushed for further ground searches. But there was a hesitation now, unspoken, palpable. Not fear of danger. Fear of trespassing into something they could not cleanly pull back from. The forest didn't feel like a scene anymore. It felt like a threshold. And in the center of it all, those two words, Echo Protocol, lingered like a question left hanging in a room that had long since emptied. It was not a name chosen for drama or effect. It was chosen because no one could shake the feeling that the forest wasn't echoing them. It was answering. It was nearly 5 months after the students vanished when the discovery was made. Early spring had begun to thaw the forest's tight grip. Snowmelt ran down the ridgelines in silver ribbons, loosening the ice-choked earth and revealing what the winter had buried. A team of surveyors, unrelated to the case, were assessing runoff damage near a narrow ravine southeast of the original search area when they noticed something pale jutting from the soil. At first, they thought it was tree root bleached by the elements, curved like bone. It wasn't. What they had found were skeletal remains, half buried in loam, cradled beneath a fallen tree whose impact had shielded the bodies from scavengers and weather. They lay together in a shallow depression, arms tangled, ribs collapsed inward. One skull was fractured at the crown, the other bore no visible trauma, but had moss creeping through the empty eye sockets. Time had softened the scene, worn it down to the echo of a final moment shared. Forensic analysis confirmed the identities within days. Casey Lynn and Ben O'Connell. The remains were incomplete but sufficient. Dental records aligned. DNA samples provided by their families removed all doubt. Their belongings were scattered within a 10-foot radius, torn scraps of clothing. A broken wristwatch frozen at 4:17. A compass cracked down the middle, its needle still and skewed. But no signs of violence. No defensive wounds, no traces of animal attack or exposure consistent with hypothermia. It was as though they had simply stopped, sat down, waited. The ravine itself wasn't marked on any map, a narrow fissure in the landscape that could only be found if you knew to look for it or were led there. It wasn't on the route they were believed to have taken. In fact, it was miles off course, in the opposite direction. To this day, no one can say how or why they ended up there. The third student, Matthew Rye, was not among them. His body was never recovered. No remains, no clothing, no trace of movement beyond what had already been found. It was as if he had never walked the same path. Or perhaps he had, and simply continued walking long after the others had stopped. His name remains on the active missing persons registry. His parents never held a funeral. Just a framed photo in a room no longer touched, a place where time refuses to pass. The official report lists no foul play, no confirmed cause of death. The bones revealed no secrets. Toxicology was impossible. The environment had stripped everything clean, like a story told and retold until only its shape remained. The case, though not closed, was moved to inactive status. There was nothing left to chase. But closure, in a case like this, isn't found in findings. It's found in the silences. The unanswered questions that coil tightly around the facts. Why were they off trail? Why were there only 2 bodies? What happened in the final hours between the camcorder's last frame and their final resting place? And more troubling still, what had made them stop? In the end, families were given ashes, words of comfort, a public statement. But the truth? It never surfaced. The mountain kept that for itself. And in the absence of answers, only the void remained staring back, unblinking. 3 went in. 2 were found. And the third, like the question itself, simply remained. Mira returned to the woods, not out of duty, but as a final ritual. Frank Callahan had hesitated to bring her back. After the discovery of Casey and Ben's remains, the case had quieted again, press coverage faded, public interest dulled by the lack of a clean ending. But Frank couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't finished. Something still hung in the trees, heavy and unresolved. Matthew Rye's absence wasn't just a loose thread. It was a wound the forest refused to close. And Mira, who had never led him wrong, had begun to stir restlessly each time they passed the edge of the trailhead. She remembered. Dogs always remember. It was early morning in late March, the sky pale with frost. Snow clung only in patches now, the earth softening beneath it. The forest felt different than before, less hostile, but no more welcoming. Frank didn't follow any coordinates this time. He let Mira lead, as he had that day by the cedar tree. She walked slowly at first, sniffing, pausing, angling her body in one direction only to shift again, as though listening for something beneath the wind. After nearly an hour of climbing, they reached a narrow ridge, a cliff that dropped sharply into a wooded basin. A place no one had searched thoroughly, deemed too remote and inaccessible. Mira stopped. Her posture shifted, not alert, not tense, still, like recognition. She moved forward, nose low, and began to paw at the ground just feet from the cliff's edge. Frank knelt beside her and helped clear the brush. There, beneath layers of pine needles and packed earth, was a canvas satchel. It was partially decomposed, but the zipper still worked. Inside were 3 items. The first was a sealed bag of trail mix, untouched, dry, still edible. It rested in the corner like it had been placed carefully, not dropped. The second was a student ID card, laminated, scratched, but readable. Matthew Rye. The photo showed him with a shy smile, the university's name partially worn from the edge. The third item was a journal. It was smaller than the one found earlier in the woods. Leather-bound, its cover cracked and darkened by time. Pages were missing, torn out, or never filled, but the remaining entries were written in a shaky, hurried hand. Many were illegible, the ink smeared or faded, but a few lines stood out. I hear them when I sleep, like they never left. Something's wrong with time here. I walk in circles, but I never come back. They didn't die, not then, not exactly. The final page contained only one sentence, written in increasingly frantic script. "If someone finds this, don't follow the voice." The line cut off. No period. No continuation. Frank closed the journal with a cold ache in his chest. Mira sat beside him, unmoving, ears twitching slightly at the breeze. The cliff before them stretched down into shadow, the trees below swaying in slow motion. There was no sign of Matthew beyond that satchel, no bones, no footprints, no blood. Just words left like a breadcrumb for someone else to pick up. A warning perhaps, or a confession. He radioed it in, voice low, careful. But in his gut, he knew there was no evidence here that would close a case. Only artifacts, only echoes. As they descended back into the forest, Frank looked over his shoulder one last time at the place where the bag had been buried. The wind shifted. For the briefest moment, he thought he heard a voice soft, too distant to understand, rising from the basin below. He didn't stop walking. Neither did Mira. Years have passed, but the forest has not forgotten, nor has it explained. Copper Ridge, once a favorite among weekend hikers and college students looking for solitude, now sits on the edge of a whispered boundary. Maps still show the trail, and rangers maintain the main loop, but few venture far beyond the marked paths. Fewer still speak openly about what the place has become. For all its silence, the woods seem heavier now, more aware, as if it's learned something from the people it once took. Reports still surface, quietly, and without much attention. Hikers whose compasses spin unpredictably when nearing the southern ridge. GPS trackers that log false elevations or routes that don't exist. One man, a wilderness photographer, claimed his digital watch reset completely after spending a night near the ravine where the two bodies were found. "Like time stopped," he said. "Or restarted. I couldn't tell which." Most write it off as equipment failure. Some don't speak of it at all. But the stories persist, particularly from those who camp alone. Strange voices carried on the wind, never clear, always just beyond comprehension. Not whispers, not language exactly, but something that presses into the mind like a forgotten name on the tip of the tongue. One woman, a seasoned backpacker, reported waking in the middle of the night to find her tent unzipped, though she had locked it from the inside. Outside, no sign of wildlife, no footprints, just a series of small stones arranged in a perfect circle a few feet from her camp. None of these incidents can be verified. None are considered evidence. Yet they echo quiet reminders of what happened that October, and the strange shape the truth took. The families of the missing still hold on. Over the years, the rawness of grief has softened into something else, not peace, but presence. Casey's mother leaves flowers every fall at the trailhead, regardless of weather. Ben's brother hikes the lower ridge once a year, always stopping at the point where the GPS last pinged his phone. And Matthew's parents never moved from their home. In an interview given only once, his father said, "We don't believe he's lost. Just somewhere we can't follow yet." His voice cracked as he added, "He's still walking." The case remains officially open, cold, but not closed. Investigators changed over time, leads thinned, evidence stored and archived in quiet government basements. But nothing definitive ever came forward. No confession, no trace of a predator, no scientific theory that could account for the sequence of events. Just a trail that bent wrong. A notebook filled with phrases no one could explain, and a voice on a tape that still haunts audio techs who swear they've heard thousands like it, and none the same. Nature has no obligation to return what it takes. It doesn't grieve, doesn't explain. The forest gives, and the forest keeps, often in unequal measure. What happened on that trail is a question folded into the soil now, carried in the roots of trees that keep growing, undisturbed, unburdened by the stories that cling to them. Some believe it was something ancient. Others say madness, coincidence, or a cruel trick of the elements. But ask those who've stood near the old path, who've heard the wind curl around their ears like breath, and they'll tell you something else. They'll tell you the woods are still listening, and they remember every name.